Once then, our thoughts were not rational. That is, all our thoughts once were, as many of our thoughts still are, merely subjective events, not apprehensions of objective truth. Those which had a cause external to ourselves at all were, like our pains, mere responses to stimuli. Now, natural selection could operate only by eliminating responses that were biologically hurtful and multiplying those which tended to survival. But it is not conceivable that any improvement of responses could ever turn them into acts of insight, or even remotely tend to do so. The relation between response and stimulus is utterly different from that between knowledge and the truth known. Our physical vision is a far more useful response to light than that of the cruder organisms which have only a photosensitive spot. But neither this improvement nor any possible improvements we can suppose could bring it an inch nearer to being a knowledge of light. It is admittedly something without which we could not have had that knowledge. But the knowledge is achieved by experiments and inferences from them, not by refinement of the response. It is not men with specially good eyes who know about light, but men who have studied the relevant sciences. In the same way, our psychological responses to our environment, our curiosities, aversions, delights, expectations, could be indefinitely improved from the biological point of view without becoming anything more than responses. Such perfection of the non-rational responses, far from amounting to their conversion into valid inferences, might be conceived as a different method of achieving survival, an alternative to reason, a condition which secured that we never felt delight except in the useful, nor aversion save from the dangerous, and that the degrees of both were exquisitely proportional to the degree of real utility or danger in the object, might serve us as well as reason, or in some circumstances better. Well, at this point, Lewis is trying to show that when we look to other sources in nature or in the natural processes for our ability to reason, well, we naturally have to turn to evolution and try to imagine how evolution could have brought that about. How could evolution have brought about our ability to reason, our ability to make inferences that aren't connected deeply or aren't connected to some unbroken, interlocked series of events that reaches deep into the past?
They're all biological reactions.
Right. So, is it the response to stimuli process that could give a solid ground, or could create a solid ground for our later ability to reason? Could that grow into? Could it morph into an ability to reason later on? That's what this is trying to dispel. Well, this is trying to explore and then dispel. Besides natural selection, there is, however, experience. Experience originally individual, but handed on by tradition and instruction. It might be held that this, in the course of millennia, could conjure the mental behavior we call reason. In other words, the practice of inference out of a natural mental behavior which was originally not rational. Repeated experiences of finding fire, or the remains of fire, where he had seen smoke, would condition a man to expect fire whenever he saw smoke. This expectation, expressed in the form if smoke, then fire, becomes what we call inference. Have all our inferences originated in that way? So there's another possibility here that simple tradition could, over time, could sort of make us feel like we were reasoning, but what we were really doing is exercising what we were really doing is exercising all of those things that had been built up in our society and in our minds by tradition. He says, have all of our inferences originated in that way, because some of those things are a lot of the things we attribute to our own thinking, our own conclusions, surely do come from that. They do come from the idea that so many of our mental processes that we attribute to a and a genuine insight, or that we attribute to our own thinking, really are built up by tradition. They really are built up by the
Tradition.
Yeah, the excuse me, the totality of what our society, what our culture has built up, through stories, through morals, through the tales that it tells. These things have all been built up by tradition, and we attribute a lot of these things. Whatever we have, a lot of times when we have an insight, a lot of times when we have a reasoned judgment, we take credit for it as our own discovery, our own intuition. But what we're in a lot of those cases, what we're doing is exercising or standing on top of what our society has created over time. So that is possible with a lot of our thoughts, but he says have all of our inferences originated in that way? But if they did, they are all invalid inferences. Such a process will no doubt produce expectations. It will train men to expect fire when they see smoke, in just the same way as it trained them to expect that all swans would be white until they saw a black one, or that water would always boil at 212 degrees until someone tried a picnic on a mountain. Such expectations are not inferences and need not be true. The assumption that things which have been conjoined in the past will always be conjoined in the future is the guiding principle not of rational but of animal behavior. Reason comes in precisely when you make the inference, since always conjoined, therefore probably connected. When you have discovered what smoke is, you may then be able to replace the mere expectation of fire by a genuine inference. Till this is done, reason recognizes the expectation as a mere expectation, as only an expectation.
I think you skipped the sentence after the quote.
Oh, yes, I did. I skipped a clause. So we'll go back there and say, excuse me, reason comes in precisely when you make the inference, since always conjoined, therefore probably connected, and go on to attempt the discovery of the connection. That's a pretty important part there. When you have discovered what smoke is, you may then be able to replace the mere expectation of fire by a genuine inference. Till this is done, reason recognizes the expectation as a mere expectation. Where this does not need to be done, that is, where the inference depends on an axiom, we do not appeal to past experience at all. My belief that things which are equal to the same thing are equal to one another is not at all based on the fact that I have never caught them behaving otherwise. I see that it must be so. And that's what he means by an axiom. An axiom is something that is a piece of wisdom that is something we all accept on the face of it because of its merits. It's not the kind of thing that needs explanation. It's not the kind of thing that needs expounding. He gave an example of one. My belief that things which are equal to the same thing are equal to one another is not at all based on the fact that I have never caught them behaving otherwise. You just see that because it's so obviously true, it must be true. I don't need to have experience to tell me that that's true. The moment I hear it and understand it, I know that it's true. And I know that it must be true always. That some people nowadays call axioms tautologies seems to me irrelevant. Tautologies are literally means to auto speak. It's a redundancy. That some people nowadays call axioms tautologies seems to me irrelevant. It is by means of such tautologies that we advance from knowing less to knowing more. And to call them tautologies is another way of saying that they are completely and certainly known. To see fully that A implies B does, once you have seen it, involve the admission that the assertion of A and the assertion of B are at bottom in the same assertion. The degree to which any true proportion is a tautology depends on the degree of your insight into it. 9 times 7 equals 63 is a tautology to the perfect arithmetician, but not to the child who is learning its tables, nor to the primitive calculator who reached it, perhaps by adding 7 nines together. If nature is a totally interlocked system, then every true statement about her, for example, there was a hot summer in 1959, would be a tautology to an intelligence that could grasp that system in its entirety. God is love may be a tautology to the seraphim, but not to me. So, this actually parallels something that you and I have talked about, and that we've heard Jordan Peterson say, that as you're learning things, as you're growing in your education, you sort of straddle the line between the known and the unknown, right? You have, if you're doing it ideally, as he puts it, you have one foot in the known, one foot in the areas of knowledge that you are secure in, that you feel comfortable in, and one foot in the unknown, where you're sort of feeling around and in the dark. So once you've come into an area, once you come into a certain security in the knowledge that you've attained, that then moves over into what you call the known. That fact that wasn't known at one time then moves over into the known, and it becomes something that you don't have to think about. It becomes something that is, once it's secure, once you've really laid your hands on it, it's something that doesn't have to be rehashed over and over again. It's understood. It becomes what Lewis here calls a tautology. It becomes something that is so obviously known and so certainly believed that it doesn't require restating, right? 9 times 7 is 63 is an example that he uses that, well, to an arithmetician, that is a tautology. It's so obvious, it comes out as an automatic response. Whenever 9 times 7 is stated as a question, 63 comes back as an answer. That's the same kind of answer you give when someone asks your name. You don't have to think about your name. It comes to you. It comes out like a response to a stimulus. But to a child learning their multiplication tables, 9 times 7 is 63, isn't a tautology. That's something that they have to understand. They have to work at to get it to the point where it's secure knowledge in their mind, right? So these are the types of knowledge events in our minds that he is trying to focus on here and say, well, is this how all of our knowledge came about? That at some point it's been built up in our culture, our society, that certain things are true and certain things aren't, and when we are faced with addressing those things, our response to that stimuli is to say these things or say those things. And it seems like reason to us, it seems like we're making an inference, it seems like we're having an intuition, a genuine insight, but we're really just restating what's been built up over time.
Mm-hmm.
But, it will be said, it is incontestable that we do in fact reach truths by inferences. Certainly, the naturalist and I both admit this. We could not discuss anything unless we did. The difference I am submitting is that he gives, and I do not, a history of the evolution of reason which is inconsistent with the claims that he and I both have to make for inference as we actually practice it. So, both the naturalist and the supernaturalist believe that reason does in fact occur, that we do in fact use it. Lewis draws the distinction by saying that it's not that we don't, that one of us believes that it happens and the other one doesn't. It's just that the naturalist gives an explanation, a history, a description of its a description of how it came to be that is completely inconsistent with the claims he makes for reason. Reason, the naturalist will say, even if he only reserves this privilege for reason for himself when he's doing the reasoning, reason is a special event that isn't connected, interlocked with all the series of events that have come before it. Even if it's only for, even if he's only reserving that privilege for that moment when he says that, he's still reserving that privilege for it. Okay, so but that history, that claim for reason, that privileged position that he's giving it, doesn't stand up against the scrutiny that his story of how reason came to be could support. So it needs to be able to be an independent event in order for it to be what naturalists and supernaturalists claim for it. So they don't disagree about it needing that, but how it came about for the naturalists would destroy that independence. For his history is the history of this reason, the history that he gives for a reason in its special privileged place. For his history is, and from the nature of the case can only be, an account in cause and effect terms of how people came to think the way they do. And this, of course, leaves in the air the quite different question of how they could possibly be justified in so thinking, which is really the question we are asking. How could you possibly be justified in thinking the way you do if the only thing informing that thinking is a series of an ironclad series of interlocked events proceeding into the past? How could you possibly be justified in thinking how you do? It's the same. I mean, it's the same problem that we addressed when we were talking about your assertion that a certain quarterback is better than any other quarterback. If you're a fan of that quarterback, someone would say, well, you're just a fan of his. That would, if they were right, if they had some substance to that claim, it would delegitimize your argument. It would delegitimize your position, because they would have shown you to be biased. They would have shown you to be hopelessly bogged down in a deterministic belief. You were bound to think that way because of your affiliations. And it could be, it wouldn't have to be just because of your affiliations in the case of a football team. It could be because of your sex, or because of your place of birth, or because of the time in history you were born, or because of your family, or because of a religion that you were born into, or because of your height, because you're not particularly as attractive as you might be, or there's a whole series of things that it could be that your opinions could be attributed to, and we could just say, well, that's why you think the way you do. Now, of course, whenever someone says that to you, you hotly debate it. You go, no, that's not why. And you go on to try to show why that's not the case. And you do this because you know, if that's true, if what they're saying is true, your opinions are meaningless. This is why you rebut that. We all do this. We all want to rebut that. We don't just accept it. And this, of course, leaves in the air the quite different question of how they could possibly be justified in so thinking. This imposes on him the very embarrassing task of trying to show how the evolutionary product, which he has described, could also be a power of seeing truths. He emphasizes seeing there. But the very attempt is absurd. This is best seen if we consider the humblest and almost the most despairing form in which it could be made. The naturalist might say, well, perhaps we cannot exactly see, not yet, how natural selection would turn sub-rational mental behavior into inferences that reach truth, but we are certain that this in fact has happened, for natural selection is bound to preserve and increase useful behavior. And we also find that our habits of inference are in fact useful. And if they are useful, they must reach truth. End quote. But notice what we are doing. Inference itself is on trial. That is, the naturalist has given an account of what we thought to be our inferences, which suggests that they are not real insights at all. We and he want to be reassured. And the reassurance turns out to be one more inference. If useful, then true. As if this inference were not, once we accept his evolutionary picture, under the same suspicion as all the rest. If the value of our reasoning is in doubt, you cannot try to establish it by reasoning. If, as I said above, a proof that there are no proofs is nonsensical, so is a proof that there are proofs. Reason is our starting point. There can be no question either of attacking or defending it. If by treating it as a mere phenomenon you put yourself outside it, there is then no way except by begging the question of getting inside again. A still humbler position remains. You may, if you like, give up all claim to truth. You may simply say, our way of thinking is useful, without adding even under your breath, and therefore true. That would be the inference, right? It enables us to set a bone and build a bridge, and make a Sputnik, and that is good enough. The old high pretensions of reason must be given up. It is a behavior evolved entirely as an aid to practice. That is why, when we use it simply for practice, we get along pretty well. But when we fly off into speculation and try to get general views of reality, we end in the endless, useless, and probably merely verbal disputes of the philosopher. We will be humbler in future. Goodbye to all that. No more theology, no more ontology, no more metaphysics. But then, equally, no more naturalism. For of course naturalism is a prime specimen of that towering speculation, discovered from practice and going far beyond experience, which is now being condemned. Nature is not an object that can be presented either to the senses or the imagination. It can be reached only by the most remote inferences, or not reached, merely approached. It is the hoped for, the assumed unification in a single interlocked system of all the things inferred from our scientific experiments. More than that, the naturalists, not content to assert this, goes on to the sweeping negative assertion. There is nothing except this, an assertion surely as remote from practice, experience, and any conceivable verification as has ever been made since man began to use their reason speculatively. Yet on the present view, the very first step into such a use was an abuse, the perversion of a faculty merely practical, the source of all chimeras. So this is a sort of reductio ad absurdum argument that Lewis is making here. He's trying to reduce the claims of the naturalist to the point of absurdity. He's trying to take it as far as it can go and show how ridiculous that would be. Right? He says he imagines this naturalist who sort of gets fed up with this conversation and says, well, perhaps we can't tell you how reason came about and give it, and by telling you how it came about, give it the privileged position which we want it to have. But we do know that we, in fact, make reasoned assertions, and that we make inferences, and because look at the world around you. I mean, we could build a bridge and set a bone and build a Sputnik, and well, isn't that good enough? I mean, we're doing things with it. It is working. We don't need these speculations of the philosopher that really is just old men sitting in a room talking about things and tying us down, bogging us down in wordplay. It's obvious we're using reason. It's obvious that evolution is a process that happened, and that the universe is an interlocked series of events that operates with rules. Isn't that good enough? We'll be humbler in the future. To hell with all this speculation and philosophical wordplay. And Lewis then goes on to say, well, okay, but then also goodbye to nature. Because what is nature? It's a giant, nature with a capital N. It's a giant speculation, a huge one. We take the limited experience that we've had, even if it's all of humankind's experience, it's still limited experience when measured against the totality of what nature is. We take all the experiences that we've had, and from there leap to this massive conclusion, this massive inference that to describe what nature is, even to give it a name. Nature, the natural, what comes about of its own accord. So this is a huge speculation that we've made when we talk about nature, because there's nowhere we can go and put our hands on nature. There's no way we can experience nature, not in the sense of the capital N. I mean, we can go outside, we can go outdoors and say we're in nature, but what we really just mean is we're part of the system that isn't curated and fiddled with by man. When we say we're outdoors. When we use nature with a capital N, we mean the total interlocked system of events and rules that governs all of everything. That's a huge jump in our speculations when we make that. And he says the naturalist then goes on to make an even bigger speculation than we make about nature. That's that it goes on. The naturalist goes on to make a negative assumption that is completely without any grounds. says, the naturalist says, not only can I say that there is such a thing as nature, an interlocked series of events that is governed by rules that we can know, but this is all there is. That's a huge negative, because it's saying it's this and nothing else. There is nothing else. This, of course, is another way to say there's no God, right? There's this and there's nothing else. It's a giant negative. Now, Lewis says this is surely the biggest assumption that anybody has ever made, and is totally without merits, because at least with our labeling of something called nature with a capital N, at least we have some experience. With saying this is all there is and there's nothing else, we have no experience to make this assumption. It's a spectacular leap. You couldn't even call it a reasoned one. You'd really have to call it one based in blind faith.
Well, why is that?
Because you have no experience with it, right? You can't. You can say I'm agnostic about there being something else. I don't know, but to say there definitely isn't something else is something that you really cannot say, because you don't have any experience that this is the case.
But you're saying we don't know what will come.
Exactly.
What is now here, and we have no way of, even with man's entire experience, it's still a small thing. We haven't seen it all, even up until this point.
Well, we definitely haven't seen it all, but at least with assuming there's a thing called nature, we have some experience. We have something to work off of. But saying there is a thing called nature and there's nothing else, that's something we have no experience with, because all we have is nature. We don't know if there's something else. That's really something you could, at least with that question, if you weren't someone who believed that there was a supernatural, you would at least have to be, if you were going to be humble, someone who was agnostic and say, I don't know. On these terms, the theist's position must be a chimera nearly as outrageous as the naturalist's. Nearly, not quite. It abstains from the crowning audacity of a huge negative. So, he's kind of there's a little dig here when he says that on these terms, the theist's position must be a chimera nearly as outrageous as the naturalist. The theist says nature exists. He agrees with the naturalist that it's an interlocked series of events that's governed by rules, but says there's something else. Okay, and this is also a towering assumption that the theist is making, along with the naturalist saying there is nothing else. But he says it's nearly as outrageous as the naturalist's position. But he says, notice I'm saying nearly here. It's not quite as outrageous as the theist's position, because at least the theist's position doesn't include the crowning audacity of a huge negative. This and nothing else. That's the huge negative there. It's a little dig at the naturalist. But the theist need not and does not grant these terms. He is not committed to the view that reason is a comparatively recent development, molded by a process of selection which can select only the biologically useful. For him, reason, the reason of God, is older than nature, and from it the orderliness of nature, which alone enables us to know her, is derived. For him, the human mind is in the act of knowing is illuminated by the divine reason. It is set free, in the measure required, from the huge nexus of non-rational causation, free from this to be determined by the truth known. And the preliminary processes and the preliminary processes within nature which led up to this liberation, if there were any, were designed to do so. So, he's separating the position that the theist is in. The theist isn't in the position of having to explain where reason came from and do so on the terms that only nature allows. Right? He can say that, well, reason existed before nature, in God, and was fed into nature by God. So it preceded nature. It's not tied to that non-rational series of events. It doesn't. The theist isn't tied down to that position. He says reason for the theist is set free in the measure that's required to have it itself be determined by the truth known, and not by. In other words, we can go back to our football example here and say that if you're not making a claim merely because you happen to be the fan of a certain team, your claim about a certain quarterback could be true because it's determined by the truth known. You could analyze the facts. You could watch the games. You could observe the talent levels, compare the positions or the players in those positions, and make a rational judgment that isn't determined merely by your biases. You could do this. That's what he means by it's set free to be determined by the truth known, rather than just determined by a non-rational series of events, where you just happen to be a fan of a certain team and believe one player to be better than all others. Now that's sort of a simplistic explanation or a simplistic example, but that would include all of our beliefs, all of our observations of the natural world would fall into this. They're not locked into, or for the theist, they don't have to be locked into the idea that they have to be explained in those terms, in the terms of cause and effect. They can be determined by the truth known. Now, not all of them are. In fact, most of them probably aren't, but they can be. The theist isn't sort of tangled up in that knot of having to give an explanation which only nature allows. To call the act of knowing, the act not of remembering that something was so in the past, but of seeing that it must be so always and in any possible world, to call this act supernatural is some violence to our ordinary linguistic usage. We're not used to calling that supernatural, right? We're not used to calling something so mundane, so jejune, so common. We're not used to calling that supernatural because we do it every day. It's so close to us, and so that he says, I recognize, Lewis is saying, I recognize this doesn't really fit most people's idea of what they would think of when they think of supernatural. You know, someone being granted a cripple being given the ability to walk again, or a blind person being given sight. That's what people think of as supernatural. You know, a lightning bolt coming from the sky to save someone that God favors. Those are the kinds of things people think of when they think of supernatural. But when you think of your own ability to think, he says that does some violence to our definition for supernatural. We kind of go, really? That's what you mean? That's what you mean by supernatural?
You mean you're talking about our ability to reason?
Yes, our ability to reason. That's what you mean by a supernatural event. But of course, we do not mean by this that it is spooky or sensational, or even in any religious sense, spiritual. All those words are in quotation marks. We mean only that it won't fit in. That such an act to be what it claims to be, and if it is not, all our thinking is discredited, cannot be merely the exhibition at a particular place and time of that total and largely mindless system of events called nature. He says this is all we mean. We don't mean that it's spooky or spiritual or mystical when we say that it's supernatural. We mean merely that it's not connected with all of the interlocked series of events of nature. That's all that supernatural means. We've got the word natural in there, in the word supernatural. Super just means not of it or above it, right? Outside of it. That's probably a better way to say it, outside of it. It must break sufficiently free from that universal chain in order to be determined by what it knows. It is of some importance here to make sure that if vaguely spatial imagery intrudes, and in many minds it certainly will, it should not be of the wrong kind. We had better not envisage our acts of reason as something above or beyond, as above or behind or beyond nature. Rather, this side of nature. If you must picture spatially, picture them between us and her. It is by inferences that we build up the idea of nature at all. And, you know, he's sort of he's ahead of me here, because what I was saying when I said it's supernatural, I was sort of emphasizing that portion of the word super, that sneaks in the idea, because we think spatially, of above, right? That supernatural is above nature, that it's positioned above it, and he says, you know, if you've got to think spatially, don't think of it as above it. Think of it as between us and nature. Think of our ability to reason, if it is a supernatural event, as between us and nature. It's through that we come to nature. It's a doorway by which we approach nature, because we build up the idea of nature through reason. Nature is a conception in our minds. It doesn't exist anywhere else. It's not. It's a concept that is helpful to thinkers. It's not helpful to nature. The idea of nature, I mean. So what is nature? What is this concept of nature that we've built up? It's a product of reason. It's by reason that we approach nature. So this is what he's saying here. It's almost as though we have to look at reason as a membrane, and it's between us and nature, and it's through that membrane that we approach nature. So don't think of it as above it or beside it or even underneath it. It's between us and nature. Without it, we wouldn't have nature at all. That's why he says that in that last sentence I read. It is by inferences that we build up the idea of nature at all. Reason is given before nature, and on reason, our concept of nature depends. Our acts of inference are prior to our picture of nature, almost as the telephone is prior to the friend's voice we hear by it. When we try to fit these acts into the picture of nature, we fail. The item which we put into that picture and label reason always turns out to be somehow different from the reason we ourselves are enjoying and exercising while we put it in. The description we have to give of thought as an evolutionary phenomenon always makes a tacit exception in favor of the thinking which we ourselves perform at that moment. For the one can only, like any other particular feat, exhibit at particular moments in particular consciousnesses, what's a tough word to say, consciousnesses, the general and for the most part non-rational working of the whole interlocked system. The other, our present act, claims and must claim to be an act of insight, a knowledge sufficiently free from non-rational causation to be determined positively only by the truth it knows. But the imagined thinking which we put into the picture depends, because our whole idea of nature depends, on the thinking we are actually doing, not vice versa. This is the prime reality, on which the attribution of reality to anything else rests. If it won't fit into nature, we can't help it. We will certainly not, on that account, give it up. If we do, we should be giving up nature too. That's the end of the chapter. That last part there, he's summarizing many of the conclusions he's drawn in the chapter to begin with. He's saying that the accounts of nature that people, or the accounts of reason that people will give when they give it in terms of nature, when the naturalist gives an account of reason in terms of nature, will always exclude the act of reasoning that the person who's giving us this account is doing at the moment he's giving it. Right? He'll say, he or she will say, well, everything that we experience, including our reasoning, is a product of cause and effect. It's a product of a deterministic system, and there's no way out of that. Well, how did you reach that conclusion?
That's funny, because he's telling me that what I'm saying and what I'm thinking isn't true, right?
But he's reserving for himself a little carved out island of uniqueness for the act of reasoning he's engaging in at the moment that he tells you none of your reason can possibly be true, or none of your reason can possibly be anything but deterministic. That's really what he's saying. None of the products of your mind could possibly be anything but deterministically defined. That's all there is, in fact. Well, then all of my reasoning is unsound. I'm in the same position as the Homer, who thinks his player is the best player, not because that player is the best player, but just because he happens to be a fan of that player's team. I'm in that position with everything, not something as trivial as football, but with everything. The problem for the naturalist at that moment is that you must have reached that belief or that idea of nature as a deterministic system in which my thoughts are also determined by an inference. You must have got there by an inference. And if all of our inferences are now in question, and they have been the moment you've said they're all deterministic, then what about yours? And what about the one you exercised at the moment you told me about this theory, this idea? That's also in question, isn't it? That's also now that's also now doubtful. In the same way that all of my thoughts are doubtful. In the same way that everyone's thoughts are doubtful. None of us know if we're touching the truth, including you, purveyor of this theory. This is the crux of this is the cardinal difficulty with naturalism. That's the name of this chapter. It's the cardinal difficulty, the principle, the primary difficulty with naturalism. Strict naturalism refutes itself. Right. This is why Lewis, when we use that word strict naturalist, we mean someone who is ironclad in their claim that nature is all that there is. Strict naturalism refutes itself. Because nature itself, that concept, was built up by inference. If inference is in question, we lose the concept of nature with it.
I see.
So, Lewis at the end here says, he kind of ends on a note that touches the quote that he began the chapter with. And he begins the chapter with a quote from I.A. Richards, who said, "We cannot have it both ways, and no sneers at the limitations of logic. Amend the dilemma. If you've got a problem with your theory, if there's a hole in it, don't sneer at the limitations of logic. Amend the dilemma. Fix the hole. The hole is the problem. The hole is where your theory pivots." And so Lewis says here at the end, "This is the prime reality on which the attribution of reality to nothing else rests, to anything else rests. If it won't fit into nature, our ability to reason, if it won't fit in, we can't help it. We will certainly not, on that account, give it up. We're not going to give up reason as the privileged thing we know it has to be in order for us to be having this conversation, and hopefully for anybody to be listening to it. If we do, we should give up nature too." Why would we give up nature too? Because nature is a concept built up through inference. Right? All of these things would be lost. Inference, our ability to infer, and the privileged position we grant inferences has to be maintained. If it won't fit into our conception of nature, that's not a problem. We're not going to give up on inference, because if we do, we'd give up on nature too.